the zero-point energy, again, this is the people discovering that there is a huge amount of energy in space that we didn't know about until recently, and that people are working on ways of harnessing that energy. So again, the spaceships might travel by somehow taking advantage of the incredible energy that already is present in what was thought to be, until fairly recent years, dead space. What kind of shifts in our philosophical framework or worldview do we need to make to grasp this phenomenon more fully? I got to keep track of my time here. Okay, we have about another hour, right? Something like that. Okay. I've touched upon this, and again, it's a large subject, but I think that at the heart of it is to develop some kind of framework that allows us to live in the paradox of traffic between the unseen world and the material world. In other words, that there can be something that is not of this world, in the material sense, can manifest in the material world. Or it can pass across dimensions and manifest. Or it can be not entirely of this world or of the other world, but of both at the same time. And that's not the way we're generally brought up to think. I mean, I constantly am well, if it's not in the physical world, I get this all the time, I'm sure you do too. If it's not in the physical material world, it must be in the imagination. It must be psychological, that's all. You know, there's no other subtleties, there's no other distinctions that occur. What sort of multidisciplinary collaboration would advance our exploration? Now, again, I can't overstress the importance of multidisciplinary work in this field. No one field can possibly grasp this matter. After my Harvard ordeal wound up in the August of 1995, I went to the then chairman of our department, who's long since gone, but he was not friendly to all of this. But I went to him, and after one of the recommendations of the committee was I should involve more colleagues in this work. Well, I had tried. I swear, I had really tried. You know, it wasn't easy. So I said, I said, Joe, I've tried this, but what should I do? And so he said, well, why don't you do? He wanted to get me out of his office. He said, why don't you form a multidisciplinary working group, which is what they do in other kind of subjects like this, like sleep or weight loss or memory, things that don't fit into one discipline, and form a group like that and take a look at it. So it took us a while to put it together. We were doing other things. It wasn't entirely because it was so difficult, but in April of 1999, we had a meeting at the Harvard Divinity School, appropriately located there, although not sponsored by the Harvard Divinity School. You know, sometimes your best allies are the buildings and grounds departments of the universities, because they just want you to rent the space. They don't care whether you're talking about spaceships or whatever. You know, the academics can be really mad, but the buildings and grounds department, they will always allow you to use their turf. So pick your turf where you want to go, and then you can do anything you want. So the Divinity School was perfect for this. Now, what happened there was we had professors from inside and outside of Harvard in about 10 different fields: anthropology, history of science, astrophysics, optical physics, psychology, psychiatry, theology, philosophy, other fields. And we looked at this abduction phenomenon in relation to other anomalies. And it was quite an interesting conversation. They couldn't handle it. You know, everybody saw their little piece of the elephant, and they tried to get around it. And finally, the historian of science, who was a very sharp woman, young professor, tenured professor, really done great work. And about the afternoon of the second day, she shook her head, having really wrestled with this for a day and a half. She said, "John, this is a wily reality." it just wouldn't behave itself. It just kept getting away. She couldn't pin it down. She couldn't put it any place, you know. And another thing that happened, she was also the chairperson of a working subgroup. We had about 25 people in all, including 6 experiencers who were each represented in these subgroups. And she chaired the subgroup on light and energy, which is one of the major, we had 4 or 5 major divisions of the field, and that was one of them. And she said, you know, at the reporting to the whole group at the end of this, she said, you know, it's a funny thing. She said, we'd start out, you know, talking about light and energy, and we'd end up talking about God. So, yeah, right. Interesting things happened when we brought people from all these different disciplines together. So one of the things that emerged from this 2 days, which is something that I'm very interested in working on myself now, is that we really don't have what might be called a science of human experience. This relates to what we were talking about earlier about the clinical assessment of a witness or the witnessing phenomenon, or how do we look at, what are our criteria of knowing human experience when we can't prove it physically, and where also it's participatory. In other words, you won't learn anything about a human being's experience if you stand back and use the subject-object separation that characterizes much of, not the best science, but much science, because they won't tell you anything. You have to, a clinician who, any of you have worked with experiencers, you know, you have to really deeply enter that person's world. That doesn't mean you're leading them, or it doesn't mean that you lose your ability to be analytic, but you have to enter that energy field in some way. You can't remain completely separate. Well, once you are engaged in a kind of co-creative participation with a person in bringing about or bringing into being their reality, then you know, that's a different kind of discipline. That's not science as the material science or physical science generally considers science to be. So we need to develop, I think, a science, what I'm calling a science of human experience. So how can we be more effective in establishing the power of this phenomenon, positively or negatively, and knowledge about it to affect constructive change? Well, I've kind of hinted or indicated what I think about this, and I'll just go through this fairly quickly. I think that one thing is to become more sophisticated in understanding physical evidence and physical laws. Again, the contemporary science will enable us to communicate more effectively with scientists. Even if it's just to learn the limits of physical laws as we now know them, and be able to speak authoritatively about the limits of what physical science knows. I mean, one of my favorite ones, and I'll share this, just say this here, is the so-called Big Bang theory, right? Well, a lot of people go by that in physics, but it's a very limited theory of the universe. I mean, how it came into being. I mean, if you ask a physicist, and I did ask one of my close colleague physicists, well, what about before the Big Bang? You know, how did you know, what was there, you know? He said, according to our mathematical measurements, that question is not relevant. Okay? Well, I didn't get to, so you can't be defensive when people do that. You have to realize that there's a mindset there, you know. So a lot of the important questions don't yield their, never mind answers, don't even yield deeper questions to the frameworks of physics in the, not, again, the most contemporary physics, but sort of traditional physics. Learn more about worldviews, scientific and political, and how these shape what we and others can take in. Well, I've spent some time on that. I just, one of my sons, who's very dear and very wonderful with me about all of this, and he's can't say he's open about it. He just trusts me, and we have a very loving relationship. But he said, you know, he was starting out as